pleasure to introduce our moderator for the day. Annie Tsai is a mother of two who is passionate about learning, mentoring, and teaching. For over 20 years, Annie has built, grown, and scaled software companies across segments, categories, and geographies. Today, she is the Chief Operating Officer at Interact, part-time partner at the House Fund, head of community engagement and learning at Moms in Tech, recently published her second book, How to Teach Your Kids Investing in 10 Easy Lessons, and writes a weekly column at the San Mateo Daily Journal, where she explores the intersection of technology, culture, and our everyday lives. She sounds like a tiger mom's dream, doesn't she? So please give a warm round of applause for our moderator, Annie Tsai.
Hello, everybody. How are you today? Thank you so much for having me in this incredible event. It's been really inspirational listening to these speakers throughout the day so far. Hopefully, you've been able to come earlier and get in on some of those talks. I am so honored to be welcoming Deb and Bethany to the stage. Deb has a storied career that is something that we'll be reading about, frankly, in the history books of the internet and social media. She has been a leader at PayPal, at eBay. She built the marketplace product for Facebook, which over 1 billion people are using today. And most recently, spent 4 years as the CEO at Ancestry.com, where a good friend of mine found his parents through Ancestry.com through that testing. And so please join me in welcoming Deb and Bethany, who is a junior in high school and is being so brave for joining her mom on stage to talk about this really, really great topic. Thank you. All right, let's dive in. So I am really curious, has anybody read Deb and Bethany's newsletter and blog about a tiger mom and her cub? I love that name, and I would be really curious because you don't often hear or see an Asian American mom and her daughter sort of sharing in the joy of writing and being creative together and putting yourself out there in the world. So how did that come to life?
Yeah, so this blog actually started around 3 years ago. I competed in an essay contest with the Chinese American Museum in DC, and it was about bridging the gap between generations. So I wrote an essay with my grandmother, kind of talking about how she immigrated to America and how her story kind of intertwined with mine. And so I actually created the idea for the blog where I was going to write with her, and we were going to kind of just talk about our generational gaps and our cultural differences. Unfortunately, before we were able to start the blog, she passed away. And I asked my mother if she would be willing to continue with me. And we changed the idea kind of from bridging the gap between generations more to this idea of tiger parenting and what it's like to be raised by a tiger parent.
Well, I'm sorry for your loss, but what a wonderful experience that must be for you two together. And I saw that you also wrote a letter to your grandmother. Is that right? And that is also on display with Asian Am News?
Yeah, so I believe that letter to my grandmother was actually the essay I wrote for the contest. And so I really wrote it based on like conversations I had with her. And I really wanted to appreciate her because I felt like a lot of the time there was like kind of a language barrier between us. And just like being able to like talk with her in like writing that letter really brought us closer together.
And Deb, how has that experience been for you?
You know, this is, when we first started this column, not sure how it was going to go because we had totally different concept and we had worked with my mother-in-law for so long on it. But, you know, it's been an amazing experience to actually see what she really thinks. So there's what kids tell you, which is absolutely nothing. And then when you force them to talk about a topic, so before we write, we actually have a list of topics. And when we talk about them, she has so many deeper and much richer thoughts than I ever imagined. Like, for example, we were talking about moving and my son went off to college and we were trying to move from one house to the other. It had been 4 years in the making. and they were dragging their feet and they just refused to move. And finally, I just forcibly moved all of our furniture and our laundry, and we moved out of the old house and left everything behind. And I wasn't sure what they really thought of it. And so I forced her to write. The next month we wrote about this. And she had really complex feelings about leaving behind all the memories from our old house, because that's where my mother lived with us. And she had also recently passed. And so we had built the new house so that my in-laws and my mom could live with us. And so in some ways we were going to a place without the people we had built it for. And she, and when I saw that, I didn't know that that's why she was worried about moving. And so it forces you to have conversations you normally wouldn't have. And it's forced us to really confront a lot of things in our relationship as well.
Deb, you've described yourself as an introvert in the past. A lot of introverts I know prefer to take the written form as a form of expression. Was that something that came naturally to you? I mean, you're also an exceptional public speaker.
Well, it's funny, when I was in middle school, and when my middle school teacher said, you need to do speech and debate when you get to high school because you're terrible at speaking. And so I did speech and debate in high school for several years, but I was super introverted, hated talking to people. I found the written word so much easier because in some ways you can control it, you can edit it, you can go back. But when you speak, the words are out there. You've already spoken them. And so I still, to this day, still feel more comfortable writing. I write every week in my Substack, and I still, like you, I wrote a book. And it's a way for me to process. I use writing as a way to process my thoughts.
And Bethany, what about you? Once this Tiger Mom and her Cub project comes to its completion, are you going to continue writing?
I think that writing is really interesting. I really like writing, but I think I also struggle a lot to do it. I am, unlike my mom, I'm more of an extrovert. If you get me talking, I don't stop talking, and I go on a bunch of tangents. But I think that writing is a really good way for me to kind of narrow down my thoughts and find what I really feel. Because when I talk, I just keep talking, and it just winds around and my ideas keep changing. But I think when I write, I have to be more intentional, and I think more about what I'm writing. So I think writing's a really interesting medium, and I do plan to continue writing after this is over.
Bethany's sounding more like a product manager every day.
Maybe we can get her into the field.
There you go. So as you think about the term Tiger Mom, what does that actually mean for you?
It's funny because I know Amy Chua, who's the original Tiger Mom, and I've met her and I've talked to her. And I read her book, and I met her daughter in an event as well. And so one of the things that I think that's really important is, it's kind of this aspiration that moms have of molding their children into success. And yet I see it as, one thing Bethany reminds me, I talked to her about the gardener and the carpenter. There's this concept that somebody wrote a book about, which is, are you actually, breaking down your children and reforming them to what you want? So you take wood and you turn it into a cabinet. Or are you a gardener, which is you're cultivating them? Whereas I see being a Tiger Mom as, I want her to reach her full potential. And how can I, in every day, help her do that? And I think that it's a controversial statement to just say, okay, I'm a Tiger Mom because I'm just making her do things. I mean, after 7 years of making her play piano, which she still doesn't play very much.
You gave up?
I quit, yeah.
Well, so I gave them a rule, which was my parents made me play piano for 7 years. So each of my children played piano for 7 years. And so, because I want them to build grit. And I want them to not quit. And I think it's really important as part of your life is even if you're not great at something, that you stick to it and you learn it. Just like writing or speaking, for me, it doesn't necessarily have to come naturally. And so I see my brand of Tiger Mom style as taking the raw material that is them and cultivating and helping them to stick to things even when it's hard, to actually build the grit to get through, things that seem really difficult. When we started this column, there were many months where she did not want to write the column, but then she was really proud of it when it was done, right? And so part of my job is to make sure you do the stick it to it part, and that you see that actually it really does pay off.
Well, how do you think parents today can do that, just that? Encourage your kids and help them get to the end. Someone said earlier, I think Amanda said earlier, or maybe it was Mimi, she said getting to 90% completion is not the hard part. It's the last 10%. That's the hardest part, right? That takes 90% of the effort. And so what do you think you've learned through these types of lessons and your mom nudging you as the cub?
Yeah, I think, okay, with the piano thing, I'm not sure it actually imparted grit in me. It gave me more stress than anything else. But I think it's like, I think a lot of what mom does, especially with the column and like how she encourages me to write it, I think like really having mom there to like motivate me to complete it is really what helps me get through that last 10% and like helps me finish the column. Because it's not really the struggle to like write the column itself, but it's like the hardest parts for me about writing the column are really the beginning when I'm a procrastinator. It's really hard for me to start doing things. And so I think it's starting writing the column and like finishing it up that are the hardest part. And I think having mom there to motivate me is like really what parenting's about, because she really helps motivate me. And like we put out great stuff every single month that I'm really proud of. And I think having mom there really helps me do that.
Was there a point where you had to provide feedback on how to more effectively motivate you? Oh, I feel a story coming.
This is the good part.
For a long time, I think mom and I, like our relationship really struggled because she had a big focus on college, especially. So we walked the dog together every night and we would talk every night, right? Because they don't trust that I'm not going to get kidnapped, which fair point. So we walked the dog together, right? And we would talk every single night. But for a long time, all of our conversations would be about college. Like, what extracurriculars can you do to get into college? What classes should you pick? And it was just really, really stressful. And I eventually just had to like talk with my mom and be like, this is not working out. Because like I was constantly angry and I would lash out at my mom a lot. And I think really changing that and like changing the way we define the conversations we have on our walks has like really helped our relationship and helped her get back to like motivating me to be the best version of myself.
How did it feel hearing that?
Well, it was great for her to be that direct, although I was a little surprised when she said, Mom, I just need you to back off. And one of the things that we talk a lot about is, you know, how do you have a constructive conversation to get what you want? And so we were talking on the way up, she was complaining about her dad doing something. And I said, I think the most constructive conversation is not, Dad, stop doing this, but hey, this is an alternative. And so what she said was, you know, this isn't working for me, right? It's not, I am not enjoying our walks together because I feel like you're pressuring me and I leave feeling worse than when we started. So alternatively, we could do something else. So can we talk about other things? And so I think this column has actually given us, for 1 week a month, we actually talk about this column every night. And we talk about kind of like the ebbs and flows and how we have that conversation. And I think it's really helped us to talk about things, but not in a direct way, but actually indirectly to have conversations around things that may be much harder to tackle directly.
I want to spend a little bit of time talking about a topic that has actually come up quite a bit today, and that's mental health. And this is something that I think as Asian Americans, as first and second generation immigrants, sort of compartmentalizing our own mental health so we can do the work that we need to do to build a good life for our families and our future, that's very important to us culturally. But Bethany, you have openly written about the struggles that you've gone with through anxiety and your journey there, which is so admirable. What made you decide to really open up about that?
I think part of it is that like my anxiety has made up a big part of my relationship with my mother. I used to lash out with her, like at her a lot because I think a lot of the stress she was placing on me about college was just contributing to my anxiety. And I would honestly just like lash out. I would like melt down. It was not good. And so eventually my mom decided to take me to a psychotherapist visit. And I got diagnosed with anxiety, and honestly, that helped us have a lot more like frank conversations. I had never thought about anxiety that much before I got diagnosed. Like I knew my brother had it, but he has like a very different kind of anxiety where he's like quiet. He like doesn't show much, but like he's like anxious. I just like yell at people. I am not a good kid, low key. But
I know this feeling.
But yeah, no, I like completely melt down, and it's like not great, right? And so I think that like defined a lot of our relationship. And once I got diagnosed and I started talking with mom more about my anxiety and like how she has experienced similar things, I think that helped bring us closer. And that's part of why I open up a lot about it in our column.
And Deb, as an Asian American mother, tiger mom, I've heard that a lot of mothers have trouble really kind of being proactive about taking those steps. What did you go through?
Well, what's interesting was when I was in high school, I used to have panic attacks, like really severe panic attacks. And I would tell my sister, and she would say, okay, go lie down. Let's not tell our parents because they're not going to understand. And she was right. Like, they just, my parents never thought I had allergies, but I was diagnosed with I was allergic to everything and ended up in the hospital multiple times. So, because they were like, there's no such thing as allergies. And I'm thinking, really? My mom had hay fever and everything, but I was severely allergic to a lot of things. And so, we knew that our parents just didn't believe when we said we were sick or, things like that. And so I felt like I was pretty open, but even still, when Jonathan was exhibiting these behaviors with anxiety, I was in denial. I was like, why is he just not doing his schoolwork? Why is he? And one of my friends pulled me aside and said, look, my son has the same, she's Asian American as well. She pulled me aside and she said, my son has the same behaviors. You should get tested by somebody. And I said, why? The young generation, they don't, why do they need this, right? I suffered through it. But it was just getting worse and worse. And finally, I had him tested and he was diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder. And he really struggled for a while, especially his freshman and sophomore year during COVID. He just had a really hard time. But it didn't exhibit very loudly. He was very quiet about it. He would just not do any of his homework, not talk to anybody. And so I really couldn't figure it out. With Bethany, it was much more she would have panic attacks and start yelling at me, which I guess that was more obvious. And so then I went back to the same psychotherapist and she diagnosed her with something similar, but slightly different exhibiting. And I was like, what are we doing wrong? Right? What? But I think Asian Americans really have a hard time with mental health, right? It's not a thing you ever talked about. I knew my parents would never, they didn't think I was allergic to food where I would break out in hives after I ate it. So why would they believe that I was having panic attacks? And so I think that that's something which, I hope as we are marginally better at this, but now I'm glad people are more willing to talk about mental health because it is such a struggle and not everyone can overcome it on their own. Eventually I asked Jonathan after he's gotten past it, he's in college, he's doing great. I said, well, what happens? What triggered you getting over it? He was like, I just outgrew it. And I said, okay, so all these years of therapy and dad driving you all these places, that didn't help. And he was like, no, not at all. But the point is, I want that for him. For him, it was just something that happened to me many years ago and I'm past it. And I look forward to that for Bethany as well someday. But it is hard because in the middle of it, you feel so helpless. And yet, I remember when talking to my husband about getting this testing, he's like, why do they need this? Young people nowadays can't. I was like, oh my gosh, you sound like our parents. And so we still talk about this to this day because he's still like, do they really need support? Do we? And and even now, he's very, he's born in America as well. But I think his parents also didn't believe in any of this either.
I think that's very real. There's this sort of belief that we grew up in this world where we had to work hard and suck it up, guys, because we just have to do it. You got to do whatever you need to do in order to get the job done. And looking at today's teenagers, they're asking for what they need and they're expressing what they need. And a lot of people still are refusing to accept that as truth. And so, Bethany, as you look at kids out there, more and more people are raising their hand and saying, I need help. What kind of support systems in an ideal world do you think would be in place for people who are raising their hands saying, I need help, something is not right?
I think this increased level of transparency has been really good for a lot of people, but I think a lot of adults still aren't super receptive to it. In my school district, we actually do have we have a bunch of licensed therapists at our school. We have everything, but I think part of it is also just taking off some of the pressure that creates this anxiety. Our school has all these resources, but the problem that contributes to a lot of us developing anxiety and all these mental health conditions is just that our school is very competitive and we're super focused on college. Everything we do is college is the one thing that will change your life and define your life forever. And it's that whole culture isn't healthy for anyone. I have some friends who are like super successful, but they always seem like super stressed. And they're always like, oh my goodness, I don't want to do my like IWA for seminar, but like they just have to keep going through it because they're like, I just have to take all these AP classes for college. And I think in an ideal world, not only would we have all these support systems, but we would also like create a world where college isn't like the end all be all. Like there is life beyond college, right? So
Amen to that. Absolutely. Okay, so I'm going to have to read my phone for this one, but this made the news recently because it just happened a couple of days ago. But there was a house that was put up for sale. Did you see this? For $4.9 million in Palo Alto on Thursday. And the listing says, you only get a couple of words, like a couple hundred words or something, right? It says, since its 2017 rebuild, every owner's children have gone on to Harvard or Stanford. Yeah. Paving the way for even greater achievements. Now it is ready to pass on its extraordinary energy to the next family. I don't know who signed off on that. That is not okay. I mean, it's funny, but how do parents avoid perpetuating that culture? What can we do when it's everywhere?
Well, first, we live in that neighborhood. So we live in Palo Alto. I see some of my friends from Palo Alto here, and we live down the street from this listing. And, there's a lot of pressure in those high schools. So Gunn and Palo Alto High School, if you hadn't heard, there was a recent suicide, it seems. And, we're putting so much pressure to succeed that if you don't make it to Harvard or Stanford, you failed already and you're 17 years old. And, Ivy Week is coming up, so all the acceptances are coming in, and the amount of stress and the buzz in the community is just so great that it's like overwhelming. But as I tell Bethany, so my husband, when he was graduating from high school in Raleigh, he got into Yale, which is his dream school, and he got into UNC. And his parents told him, "You can't go to Yale. We can't afford it. You have to go to UNC." And he said he had never, and he's like the mildest mannered guy in the world, and he got so angry with his parents, and he said, "I was really, really, really upset." But in so many ways, he's like, UNC gave me every opportunity in the world. He made his closest friends there, who we're friends with to this day, and he went on to go to Harvard Law School. So I think it worked out okay for him. So, the point was he had this dream of going to Yale, and it was like his parents took it away from him. And so, but I said, and it's because of that I met him my first weekend in college when I went to Duke. And so, one of the things that you never know is that you build a life based on the path that you're on, and you're choosing and it's not, you don't get into Harvard or Yale or, Stanford and your life is over. In fact, your life will continue. And some of the best people I've ever worked with didn't go to these big name schools. They're just like incredible people who've it doesn't matter what school they go to, because after you're out of school for, 5-10 years, it's something else. And so instead, I really want to focus on the long arc of life, which is 4 years. But I think, there is a tremendous amount of pressure. Like when early decisions come in, everyone's buzzing. Well, who got in? Oh, so-and-so got rejected. I can't believe, and they just, it's a lot for kids who are making a decision at 17 years old. And I think it is not good for our kids' mental health. But that said, we all play this game, right? Like parents in Palo Alto are looking at that listing and saying, oh, but this might increase my kid's chance of getting a Harvard or Stanford.
It was written for a reason, right? Yes.
They think it's going to sell that house. That's why.
And what is your reaction to that listing?
okay, it's hilarious for the record. My second reaction is, Mom, we should go buy that house. I want to go to Stanford.
We just moved we just moved into our new house, which we built. And maybe I can say after this house was built, every kid... I'm just kidding. No pressure, Bethany.
We can have an absolute banger of a list. Hey, I just have to get into Harvard or Stanford.
That's right.
But your early decision, hopeful. So you have talked about wanting to sort of follow in your mom's footsteps for college. We won't say which college to out loud to cross your fingers. But why do you want to follow in your mom's footsteps for your upper education?
I think the reason I want to kind of follow in my mother's footsteps is, one, the college. okay, Duke, it's on the opposite side of the country, and I do plan to come back here after I go to college. So my mom was like, you should like go see the world. So I guess Duke is the world. But yeah, no, I'm kind of interested in going into a college that's like on the other side of the country so I can kind of explore and like get a chance to see like something that isn't just Palo Alto, you know? And like my brother went off to Boston College and he's like living it up in Boston. He has all these great stories of like his roommates and like walking to the gym in the snow. Yeah, I don't know what he's doing. But
Are you ready for winter?
no.
But I do think one of the things, one thing is the Bay Area is such a bubble and it's so different. I grew up in South Carolina. My husband grew up in North Carolina, and it's like such a different world. And we got married in Atlanta. And so we came out here just because I was going to business school at Stanford, and we were only going to stay out here 2 years, and we thought this place was really weird. And then we realized we raised our kids in this really weird place, like 2 miles from Stanford. And and it's very different than the rest of the world. And, we told them, if you want to come back, we want you to come back to the Bay Area. We want you to come back to Silicon Valley, but see the world so that you can see that the country is not like this, that there's so many different kinds of people, different experiences you're missing out on. And so we do encourage them to leave the state at least. So no San Diego, no LA, like go all the way and see first, weather and mosquitoes. But other things that I really want them to see is like that there's just different cultures too. And culturally, America is, we are the size of like all of continental Europe in this country. And we are in many ways like as different as multiple countries outside of the language. And so I do think it's really important that, one of the things I want to see them develop is more awareness of what the rest of the world looks like.
And something that I think we're all very fortunate to experience here is that we see a lot of people that look like us, that understand our culture. What are you going to bring with you? Let's assume that you end up going to the East Coast for undergrad. Like, what parts of your life here are you going to bring with you to share with that community?
Well, one thing that Mom always packs for Jonathan every single time he visits is she always makes him a Lumi fan to freeze and take home. So definitely that. But I also think that, honestly, I don't think that college will be that different from here because I think college itself is also kind of a bubble. And I think when I go off to college, I'll still see a lot of people who are like just like me there. But I do hope to bring a little bit of that California flair wherever I go to college.
That's great. So one thing that I'd love to dive into just a little bit, Deb, while we have a few more minutes is you have this incredible career that was really focused on building products. For those of you who have not worked in tech, when you are working at a fast-growing tech company, it's very atypical to have a lot of women around you. Can you talk to us a little bit about what it was like being both a leader in tech in fast-growing companies, but also a woman leader in tech?
It's interesting. Ascend Foundation actually did a study of Asian Americans in tech. And they said being an Asian woman, I think it was something like 13% of tech companies are Asian women and 3% of executives. And so they're the least likely group of people who are represented at the rank and file to ever make it to the top. And that's absolutely true for a lot of tech companies. And I was one of the few who made it. And it's funny, I spent very little time thinking about that while I was there. But then when you wake up one day and you look around and no one looks like you, and you think, wait a minute, like, what happens? And so, people ask me like, well, what was your path? And I said, well, first, it's better to be lucky than to be good. I mean, it's great to be good, but like being very lucky helps a lot. Having great sponsors, having great mentors. But nobody ever says to you, we're not going to promote you because you're Asian and you don't exhibit the behaviors we're looking for. We're not going to promote you because you're a woman. And so you have to navigate and understand the dynamics and the culture and really adapt so much. And so when I wrote my book, Take Back Your Power, I wrote the first chapter and I said, I hope my daughters will pick up this book one day and it'll be so anachronistic, they'll laugh at what's in here. Because, you read these books of like advice. I read these books from like the 50s, advice to like housewives. And I'm just like, what? Like, it's so anachronistic. It's like, you should put on a perfume before your husband gets home. So that I'm like, I took a seminar class in college with when we read a bunch of these books, and I was like, this is really crazy, right? But it was about how you want to be the mistress for your husband. Anyways, it was written in the 50s. Let's put it up. I told my husband about it. He was like, what? But I think one of the things that is so important is that you are authentic to yourself, but you also learn to find your voice in the workplace. And so, we talked a little bit about this, but before we got on there, it's like, who are you and what do you represent? And how do you bring other people along? One of the things is we don't look like the other people. So I make this joke, and by the way, this has been true the entire time I was CEO of Ancestry, and I was the head of this very big team at Meta. I have never gotten the dinner check for any team dinner I have ever hosted. Not once, okay? They always give it to the most distinguished man at the table. So usually it was a man with a beard or the one with the tallest or the white hair, whatever it is. Not a single time has anyone handed me a check. One time I put my credit card down. I had my name on it. And they handed it to another woman who was white and on my team. And I was like, okay, I can't even, my name is on, so I'm just saying, because I don't look like the leader, and I don't blame these people. People are like, are you upset? And I just laugh. But it's because you don't look like the leader, right? If you're playing the odds, 3% chance that you're the leader, right? So why would they pick you? And so I do think a lot about that, which is I hope someday that that's not how society works. But you think that microcosm of the waiter choosing the person to hand the check to is a microcosm of every person you encounter at work. And I write a lot about that because, we were trying to buy a company when I was at Facebook, and the CEO pitched to the guy who was a skip level down from me the entire time, until PJ turns and goes, actually, she decides if you buy the company. And that founder was so horrified. And the thing was, he's not a terrible person. He's actually a very lovely person. But he was just playing the odds, clearly. And I was like, should I embarrass him? Should I say something? But in the end, PJ's the one who spoke up. I do think that we struggle with that, right? Which is like, what is your identity in the workplace? And how do we bring more people along? So I hope part of getting to the top, the C-suite, is that we bring more people along that look different, and that's okay. And someday it's going to be they hand the check to whoever is the closest to the waiter, as opposed to whoever is the most distinguished and looks like he's going to pay the bill.
I love that. I think in Asian cultures also, typically the person who ends up picking up the check is the eldest, typically a male, right? And so there are definitely a lot of layers there. Okay, I have a home question for you. And Bethany, if you want to, you might have a different answer for this, but you were a part of the rise of social media. And, we always hear the stories about like Steve Jobs never let his kids play with iPads. So tell us, when did you get access to social media, and what was how did that conversation go? And, devices and all of that stuff. I think modern parenting today is like walking on eggshells. You don't want them to have access to it, but all their friends have access to it. And so you talk about societal pressures, right? It's tough. So what happened in your home?
Yeah, so I got my first phone when I was going into 6th grade because in my school district, most of us will bike to school. And my parents were like, I really hope she doesn't get kidnapped. So they gave me a phone. So my brother and sister both also got phones when they entered 6th grade. But I did not actually download my first social media until a little bit after that. I remember when I was 12 or 13, Mom was like, Bethany, please download Facebook.
Obviously, because you had to test it, right?
Well, we were actually using Messenger to communicate, and it was starting to become a problem because they had this antiquated kids Messenger. And so one of the things that it was very interesting in our households, because I worked in social media, was the kids had this visceral, that's mom's thing. I don't want a Facebook account. I don't want an Instagram account. Until later, they got Instagram accounts, but they certainly were not really indoctrinating to wanting that, because in some ways it's super uncool when your parents work on it. So maybe that helped a little. Like Steve Jobs kids are like, I don't want an iPhone. I want a Pixel. But I think one of the things that, helped was also, we had a lot of parental controls over it, but still, kids get access to so many things, right? And their computers and with their friends. And so you can't control everything. And so then it's about teaching them responsible usage. And, there have been times when I'm like, okay, this is too much. Like you're watching too much on YouTube or whatever. And one of the things that we talk a lot about is how to be, instead of being consumers, to be creators. So you can consume and just like mindlessly watch a bunch of videos, or you can create, you can draw, you can, write. And so we talk a lot about that in our household as well, which is consuming is a passive activity, but creating is putting something in the world and learning a new skill. And so we are more open, like they have access to the iPads primarily because I actually love that they like to draw. And so, we use Procreate and we did like drawing lessons together on it.
I literally just had that conversation with my son. So I appreciate you for sharing that. We are going to maybe move to some questions.
Yes, and we have a mic, and to encourage everybody to ask your questions. Everybody who asks will get a Dokbi keychain, who's also from a mompreneur, so we'll be passing that out. But please, raise your hand, ask questions of this fabulous panel.
Hi, Deb and Bethany. I'm Denise Ang. So I have an 11-year-old daughter. I'm really envious of your relationship. It's my goals. Now I'm going to walk the dog with my daughter tonight. So I want to ask a question around the tiger tendencies that I have as a mom. And how do I balance that in terms of writing the script of success for my daughter versus allowing her to discover her own success narrative? How do you do that?
Well, I think it starts like, for example, I was one of those parents who, when my kids were born, I immediately put them on a schedule, right? They ate and slept on a schedule. We wrote it down. I sleep trained each of the kids at 2 months. I taught them each to read between 3 and 4 so they could read by the time they were 4. I was very locked in early on. And I think it's like, for me, it was like really strict up front. My parents told me, if you're really strict up front, then like you're so happy when you loosen up that, kids won't even notice. And so it was very interesting because my parents were actually very, very laissez-faire. They were very strict when I was a kid. And then when I was a teenager, people were like, did you have a curfew? I'm like, not really, but I never went anywhere. And so it was just like, because it just never occurred to me to go anywhere because I'd never been anywhere my whole life. And so, I kind of had that philosophy, which was very strict up front and then slowly like letting go one thing at a time and giving them responsibility, but then reining it back in when things weren't working. And so I think that helped. But, for example, there was a script, like my son wanted to go to college and study political science. And I'm like, absolutely not. My husband has a degree in political science, and he was like, absolutely not. And so he's studying business, right? He's studying business and he's studying data science. And, because we just said, hey, look, you're not going to a private university to study political science so that you could go 3 more years to be a lawyer. And then you decide you don't want to be a lawyer. So what are you going to do with your life, right? You need to have some hard skills to go with the soft skills. And so go figure that out. And so he was like, okay, great. So he went through all the course catalogs and talked to us, and then he ended up on the data science side. And so I do think that there's like freedom, but then there's also helping him navigate because, it's really hard. Like if you have an English degree, you could do a lot with it, or you could have a really hard time finding a job. And I wanted him to have enough hard skills that he wasn't going to struggle. And so it is a balancing act of saying, yes, no, maybe, and guiding as opposed to, as I said, like gardening versus like, being a carpenter and breaking down. And so, he chose the college he wanted an ED to, and, it probably wouldn't have been our first choice, but he's really thriving there and he's having a great time. And so I can't say that was a mistake. And I'm glad he pushed back and did what he wanted.
Hi, I have 2 daughters, and I find it hard to juggle the generational or the cultural expectations of raising my daughters in that culture expectation, but also trying to be a little bit more lax because I found that the strictness was what was so hard on me growing up and meeting those expectations. How do you find that can come into play now as a child trying to figure out life, but then as a mother just trying to also honor your culture?
I guess I want to hear from Bethany, whether she thinks I'm doing a good job.
I think you're generally doing a good job.
Meets expectations.
Yeah, not much room for improvement, but maybe a little bit.
There always has to be some room for improvement, though, right?
But I do think a lot of times kids don't tell you, right, until much later. Like Bethany said, hey, I used to really struggle after our walks because I would cry. I would go to my room and cry because I was really upset that you're putting so much pressure on me. But she didn't tell me until 2 years later. So I was like, because a lot of times kids don't want to tell you. I think what has been great about the column is it's a lot of things I didn't understand about her. I'm like, let's put that on a list. So like she does not want to get her driver's license for some reason. And finally I put it on the list. I'm like, we're writing about that. And then she said, she explained her point of view, which actually made a lot of sense, but she had never explained it. She was just like, I don't want to do it. And so sometimes I think our kids shut us down. And so finding a way to engage with them, to get them to open up. And many times we talk about it. So we go on our walks, we talk about the topic, and I write a section, she writes a section. And when I read her section, it's like completely different than what she said to me, even on the walk. And so I don't know, she just reflected more. And I'm like, whoa, that's not what you said. But it actually is, in many ways, forcing that conversation. I found this book, How to Talk So Your Kids Will Listen and How to Listen So Your Kids Will Talk, I think is what it's called. I think that was very helpful as well, which is giving them space to process and then giving them space to feel safe to say, hey, this isn't working.
Yeah, I think a hard thing is, for me, it's often really hard to be transparent with my parents, or at least it used to be. I think walking the dog together has helped a lot. But I think part of it is that for a long time, I was really scared of talking about things like why I didn't want to get a driver's license, because whenever I'd have conversations about this with like my parents, they'd be like, but driver's licenses are so great. And they would get like kind of accusatory, and it would be hard for us to talk because it would be hard for us to like understand each other's sides. Where I think writing kind of helps with that, because you're not having a direct one-on-one conversation. You're instead like writing what you think, and then you're coming back, you're reflecting on it, and then you're reading about what they think, right? And so you're having a conversation, but it's not a conversation where you can like launch like verbal attacks at each other about like driving, So I think like being like not so accusatory, which is also I think one thing that Mom changed a lot after like I had that conversation with her, where we kind of start listening to each other more, and we stop we stop pushing our opinions as strongly and start like listening more than like just trying to talk.
Good afternoon, and thank you ladies for being here. I have a two-part question. The initial question is, my daughter is 27 and she's director of life cycle marketing for a tech financial crypto firm, and probably with an engagement of a million people. But none of her bosses knows exactly what she does, because she does all the coding and for the marketing and things like that. So a lot of the time she'll come up with the solution. However, others will get the credit for it because they're not showcasing her. So, and literally since she's been out of school, maybe she's had 3 or 4 jobs, but each time she's moved up to another level. So my question is, how does she get to that point of CEO? And then the second question is that she's developed an app for passwords. And I wanted to know where she would look for funding as well.
Great. Well, your daughter sounds extremely accomplished. I do think a lot of times, like I've done a lot of talks with especially Asian American crowds, and one of the things I say is like, how do you promote, talk about what you're doing? How do you open up and share? And someone's like, I'm really bad at self-promotion. And I'm like, if you treat it as self-promotion, you're not going to do it. Right? But instead, if you treat it as educating the executives on the important work that I do, getting my team more resources, like having her reframe that, and then having her have sponsors who help amplify her voice. Does she have somebody who's a skip level or in another department that can help that? I write a lot about sponsors and mentors, and in the workplace, that is one of the most important things that opened the door for my success. Was the step functions in my career were a manager or a skip level manager who said, here's an opportunity, I'm opening that door, and I'm putting my neck on the line for you to get that opportunity. I had a boss who, I'd been at Facebook for 2.5 years. I had a baby, so for about 2 years, and I took some time off. I came back and I got to my 7th manager in 2.5 years. And every one of them promised to promote me if I did X. I worked on a project that was basically 15% of the company's revenues when it went public. So it wasn't like we lacked success, but no one knew about it and no one cared. And that manager's like, no, you're going to be VP here someday, and here's how. I'm like, you're not even a VP. And so, Doug was like the greatest ally for me, because he was somebody who opened that door. When he left, he gave me his job. He eventually supported me to get his manager's job. The point was, it's so important to have people who champion you. And if you don't, that's like a huge detriment. From a funding perspective, I think like for somebody who hasn't been in the startup world, is not as well connected to VCs, I find accelerators to be really powerful. If she can get into a cohort like Techstars or Y Combinator, I think that is a great way because then you can get validation, but also get support. Because a lot of first-time founders don't have the support necessary to actually take something off the ground.
That was an excellent Tiger Mom question. Well done.
So unfortunately, that's time. I'm so sorry, but can we please give a round of applause to our amazing
Thank you, Bethany. Thank you, Deb.
panelists?